Kevin Gordon here from Autosavant.com, coming to you from the 2013 Hyundai Elantra GT. One of three Elantras that Hyundai is offering at this point: the coupe, the sedan, and the GT, or the wagon, or the hatchback, whatever you'd like to call it. It's a 5-door when you really get down to it. And the GT winds up being the most unique of the Elantras as a result of the fact that it's really more based off of the i30 that Hyundai sells in Europe than it is the American version of the Elantra. And even if you didn't know that it was based more off of a European model, you might guess. And the reason is it's a practical, well-finished, decent driving car that's a bit underpowered and has a manual transmission, which, if you've ever been fortunate enough to travel to Europe and rent a car, most likely it looked something like this, at least in form factor. Powering the Elantra GT is a 1.8 liter inline-4. It's pretty common across the Hyundai lineup. That makes 148 horsepower and 131 foot-pounds of torque, which aren't bad numbers, right? They're competitive across the class of cars like this, and in some ways, because of the weight of the Elantra, Hyundai likes to claim that it's one of the better power-to-weight ratio cars in its class. But there's something about the 1.8 that just is not enormously satisfying. It doesn't have a lot of torque at the bottom of its rev range like the Volkswagen does, and it doesn't really have a high-end, willingness to rev the way the Focus does. So it does sort of split the middle, but ultimately winds up being a bit of a unsatisfying experience, right? It's competent, just not enormously enjoyable. And I think a lot of that comes down to the gearing of the manual transmission that's in this one. So Hyundai's gotten a bunch of flack about its ratings from the EPA on both their city and their highway numbers. And as a result, this car was recently readjusted. I think they took a single digit out of the city number and 2 out of the highway number. So the old numbers were 28 in the city, 39 on the highway, and the new numbers are 27 city, 37 highway. And if you drove this car the way the EPA, I think, would prefer everybody drove cars, I actually don't think the original numbers were that far off. I know that everybody had a bunch of issues and there's class action lawsuits and all that kinds of good stuff, but really, I think the reason that fuel economy gets hurt in the cars is they are geared for fuel economy, but to really drive them in traffic and in the real world, you wind up using way more throttle than the EPA would plan to, and as a result, the economy of their cars is hurt quite a bit. So during the time that we've had it, which has not been an easy time in any way, really pretty limited highway driving, mostly city and back road type stuff, it's averaged 28, which is actually not that bad. I can tell you that in cars of this class, for the way that I drive them, that pretty much falls where it should. So that 6-speed transmission that's in the Elantra GT, even though it's a little tall in the gearing, isn't the greatest of units out there, right? It's a little rubbery. It's not distinct in where it's going to shift, but it is difficult to miss gears in it. And the synchronizers that they've put into the 6-speed unit work quite well. I mean, they work well enough that if you're confident enough to do so, you can shift it no clutch, right? Up and down, no problem, no clutch. The synchronizers are doing their jobs. So it's not a bad transmission, just not, again, the most of engaging ones that's available in the class. The Elantra basically comes in, the Elantra GT, excuse me, comes in basically 3 flavors. The base version with no options comes in with destination, delivery, all that kinds of good stuff at $19,300. This one that includes the style package, which gets you 17-inch wheels, leather inside, the big panoramic sunroof, and a few other little things, bumps it up to about $22,000. And then there's a tech package that this car does not have that you can get, which adds another $2,500 for, you know, a maxed out version of $24,500. So it's not inexpensive, right? $22,000 for this car as its option. It's pretty much right in the playing field of everything else that's out there. From a driving perspective, the GT does again, pretty good job. You know, it's a pretty simplistic suspension system underneath it. It handles well. It's flat and cornering, like, you know, in that style pack. The other thing you do get is upgraded spring rates, and I think a thicker rear stabilizer bar for a bit more flatness and cornering, which is good. You know, from any type of enthusiastic driving perspective, it's just going to push in corners. Now, if you really do get aggressive with liftoff in corners, you can get the back end to rotate a bit, but really it just wants to terminally understeer when you really try to push it anywhere. But with that, and even with the simpler suspension system that's on the Elantra GT, the ride's really quite composed. It's one of the better features of the car. You know, it's smooth, it's never crashy. In here, it's been rock solid. You know, there's no creaks, rattles, groans, nothing. You can tell that the platform's actually a pretty stiff setup, and as a result, the suspension tuning, they can actually do a nice job, even though they're not using any of the more complex suspension technologies. The steering's an electric assist unit that, for the first time ever, Hyundai is allowing you to pick your level of boost. So you get 3 steering modes: normal, sport, and comfort. Realistically, I've just left it in normal. Sport, again, just sort of makes it overly stiff without any real gain in feedback as far as what's going on, but, you know, can't complain too much about it. The other thing that the Elantra GT manages to do well is look nice. You know, from an outside perspective, there's sort of the lovers and the haters of hatchbacks and wagons, but they really did a very nice job styling the car. You know, it's got big, sort of aggressive wheel arches that, with the 17-inch wheels, they're pretty well filled from a fender gap perspective. The wheels that are on this one have little chrome inserts, as well as sort of the typical matte alloy aluminum look that are quite nice. On the inside, it's handsome in here, well finished. You know, the steering wheel feels good. The seats are nice and comfortable. It's one of, I will say, the nicer versions of leather that you're going to get in this price range and in this type of car. The seats are well bolstered. In the style pack, you get power in the driver's side as well as power lumbar, so you can find a good driving position. The steering wheel tilts and telescopes, and it telescopes, you know, quite a bit. It does good job of allowing you to find a comfortable driving position. And the final nice feature of the Elantra GT is that it does do quite well from a storage perspective. You know, the rear seat is completely livable, even with me where I sit. You know, I'm 6 foot tall, and still you can sit behind yourself comfortably. You're not suffering back there. The rear seats both fold down and wind up being, you know, propped up at an angle, or the seat bottoms in the back flip up, allowing for a completely flat load floor back there. behind the rear seat, there's quite a bit of storage space, as well as, under tray storage space on top of the spare tire. So, it's a practical little package of a car. Where does that place it amongst its competitors? And what I would say, its competitors wind up being a base Volkswagen Golf and one of the more base versions of a Ford Focus. Well, the Golf really is pretty Spartan when you get it at these price points. And its base engine, while being a bit more torquey, it allows it to be a little bit easier to drive in the city, is another thrashy, unenjoyable to rev unit. The Focus engine's a bit more refined, it's a bit sportier from a driving perspective, but at least what I've always found with the Focus is when you build one the way that you'd want it, because Ford has a pretty extensive options list on that car, it does get pricey fast. I mean, if you start to look at the Focus, you'll quickly get towards 30 grand before you know what you're doing, where this car at 22 and a half has most of the critical creature comforts. I'd say the only thing it's missing at this price point is climate control. So you still get manual heating and cooling, but pretty much everything else that you'd expect, it's included. So there we go, the Hyundai Elantra GT for 2013. It's a practical, good-looking, okay to drive little package that, if you're in the market for something like this, is definitely worth a test drive, because I can tell you that the engine and transmission pieces of this car that I have some issues with, I think will sort of immediately become apparent to you if you're in the market for a car like this, as to whether or not you don't mind them or you like them or any of those things. So as usual, Kevin Gordon from Autosavant.com, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon.